Okay, welcome to your first day with Mr. Hart Overseas, and we are, or you are, going to attack Chapter 9, the last chapter, and it's a big one, of Unit 3 before gearing up for your first team exam. I do want to say at the top of Chapter 9, you have a video box with the 4 videos I would show if I was teaching in person. You can kind of pick and choose how you want to approach. You do 2 at the start of the lesson, intermittently as they show up topically, save them for the end, whatever. The Hamilton versus Jefferson clip is fantastic. I'd honestly maybe recommend watching that after I cover their battles, because the conversation from that TV show will make more sense to you after I get done with those slides. There is one time during the lesson you're actually going to pause and read something on the screen here and answer a couple pop-up questions, and then you have a little paper handout on the Alien and Sedition Acts. It's not going to take that long at the end of the lesson, okay? I am recording this in July over the summer, so hopefully everything is still applicable and it's history, so it should. Ideally, and honestly, I think you can get this done. Get all the Chapter 9 notes, any video watching, the little paper handout, maybe even probably your homework. You get to that in the period with your Chapter 9 study guide, and then you'd be ready for your Team Albert Day that you will have on Thursday or Friday of this week. So I'm going to jump right into it. Good news is with these videos, you can adjust the speed. There should be closed captions as well. So we're going to start with a pretty famous person in U.S. history, which is George Washington, who you've already been introduced to with the Revolutionary War. He is the obvious and really the only candidate in our first presidential election, because we left off last time with the ratification of the Constitution in 1788. And by the time it's processed, he's going to be, it's kind of the biggest blowout in American presidential election history because he doesn't really have a challenger. He's going to win our first presidential election, and John Adams will also be deemed through the Electoral College as vice president. The first, one of the biggest things Washington will contribute is the creation of what we are fairly familiar with in America, which is the president having a cabinet, a whole bunch of secretaries that he has by various titles and departments. And nowadays, I think it's like 14 or 15. Don't quote me on that. But he starts out with a mere 3: Secretary of State, his first Jefferson, Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton, of course that's going to be like finances, and Secretary of War, which you might know better as a Secretary of Defense, former Revolution General Henry Knox. So Washington is now our first president, but a common misconception, it takes 13 years after we declare our independence for Washington to be president. There's the map of the first electoral college. Note that North Carolina, Rhode Island, and New York, because they were the last 3 states to ratify the Constitution, they're not in the game yet, if you will. I think New York was, but they didn't get their electors done in time, and Rhode Island, I think North Carolina hadn't signed or something like that. So actually only 10 states ended up contributing votes to Washington. Now, pretty early on, post-ratification of the Constitution, Washington taking office, James Madison, the father of the Constitution, is going to coin or pen, and I have a really good graphic on each of the 10 on your lesson itself, the Bill of Rights, which will be passed by Congress in 1791. These are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution and some of the most famous elements of our government and things, individual liberties that people take great pride in even to this day. Freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, no cruel and unusual punishments, the right to a lawyer if you're accused of a crime, fair and speedy trial, juries of your peers, and on and on. There had kind of been a wink-wink agreement to anti-federalists that if they ratified the Constitution, and states also that were wary about it, that something like this would be added fairly early on, and that word is kept with the creation of the Bill of Rights, which has been integral to American society and American government all the way until present time. The other thing that the Constitution established was the ability to have a judicial branch, which previously under the Articles of Confederation, that did not exist. The Judiciary Act of 1789 is basically going to set in motion the creation of said judicial branch. It's going to establish a Supreme Court, John Jay will be the first Chief Justice, along with 5 associates. Nowadays, we have 9 people in the Supreme Court. It's also going to set up a federal district and circuit court system. It will establish the role of an attorney general, who's like the lead prosecutor, lead lawyer, if you will, for the federal government. And as I just mentioned, Jay, first Chief Justice. So you see the ball rolling. Foundational pieces that we're very used to today in our federal government, Bill of Rights, a Supreme Court, are going to get molded shortly after the Constitution is going to allow for those things to happen. Again, look at the graphic that I put in, Bill of Rights. If it was a government class, I have you playing games with it, memorizing it, stuff like that. But it gives you a basic rundown of the 10 Bill of Rights. Now, I filled in this slide over Alexander Hamilton here, if I can get my own face out of the way, for you, not so you can skip it and not listen to me, but actually because it's a little bit of a confusing topic, for you to follow along, because Hamilton's financial stuff can get confusing. So just slow down and listen to me carefully here. Alexander Hamilton, Washington Secretary of the Treasury, wanted to extend federal power and federal influence, particularly with money. He wanted a more federal approach to America's finances. And his great theory was that he wanted America's government to keep and basically create a national debt, which he saw as a national blessing. Most of the time, debt has a negative connotation. You know, someone in credit card debt today, we talk about America's trillion, I don't know how many trillions it is now, trillions of debt today is a problem. But Hamilton's original theory or concept was that debt was good for government. And he didn't want to just have debt and stare at it. He wanted the U.S. government to be able to pay off said debt by funding at par, which is just a fancy way of saying America's government would always, no matter if they owed people domestically or foreignly, America, you could always trust on the first of the month, if you will, that America would make its payments. And the great logic behind this is that if people were owed money by America, or people was like foreign countries, of Britain, of France, of Spain, whatever, if people needed us to pay them back, then our financial partners will have a vested interest in America succeeding as a young baby deer country, if you will. Because if America collapsed, that debt's never getting paid. So he thought, Hamilton that is, if we take on debt, more and more people will be vested in America growing and succeeding, becoming financially wealthy as a country, because they'll need our monthly payments and so on and so forth. Build credit, earn respect. The other piece of Hamilton's debt collecting was something called assumption, which is it's in the word assuming. He wanted the federal government to collect and take on all of the individual state debts, which up to this point they had to take care of on their own. And similar to like with individual Americans with the student loan conversation today, there were disagreements. States that had very small individual debts, like Virginia, were not a big fan of the federal government coming in and just scooping up all their debt as sort of a power play. Just like someone with like really low student loans today might not actually want their loans forgiven because they maybe worry about taxes going up because of federal government programs, blah, blah, blah. But with assumption, large debt states like Massachusetts at the time loved the idea, hey, yeah, come forgive or take our debt, federal government, because that would be in their interest. Just like someone today individually with $100,000 of college student loan debt might love the idea of loan forgiveness because they're struggling to make their monthly payments. And as so many things in government end up being, there was a compromise necessary. So basically how we get Washington, D.C., our national capital, is through this. The South, and obviously D.C. is on the border of Maryland and Virginia. The idea was the capital would be put in the South, if you will, as sort of a compromise of sorts, but the federal government is allowed to, and this is what happens, takes on all of the state debts from the states that supported it to not supporting it. But the compromise was southern states, hey, we'll put the capital down there, but we are going to assume all state debts. Now, you're going to take on a bunch of debt. You're going to need revenue and money as a government to be able to pay off said debts. And the only way, because they're not a business, they don't produce anything. How do governments make money? They're going to make it through taxes. This little chart over here on the left is a really simple visual that can kind of help you understand all this money stuff I'm talking about. And Hamilton's first big proposal with how do we collect money to pay, how do we fund at par, was creating a tariff, which was basically a tax on anything that's shipped in foreignly into America for sale. And it is the first tariff law, started I think about 8% ever passed, and it's going to increase and be a big factor in America's economy and tax policies moving forward. Basically set an 8% income revenue stream for the government on foreign goods. The other logic behind it was to create a protective wall to allow U.S. industries, who obviously don't have to pay the tariff because they're making things inside the United States, it's not a foreign commodity, to be able to kind of have a leg up competing with bigger, more established markets, particularly in Europe. Now, other small thing you can see in the middle of your little graphic over there is there was an excise tax. We have an excise tax on things like cigarettes. I even think like tanning salons have excise taxes. A lot of times alcohol, sometimes items like that can have excise taxes on them today that are high demand, not super healthy. I'm getting a little sidetracked here, but back then they created an excise tax on a few items domestically, and the biggest, most notable one was whiskey. I think I'm about, bless me, thank you. I'm too deep in this video to start this recording over. Whiskey was very popular back in the colonial time period before and after the Revolution, and that whiskey tax was notably unpopular. And it's not too different from like Townshend Act tea stuff pre-Revolution. It's still a popular drink. But again, Hamilton's plan, we got to raise revenue, we got to tax some stuff. We're going to do most of it through tariff collection, but also through some domestic items like whiskey. Now, another piece of Hamilton's financial goals was having a national centralized bank that could control the money supply and the borrowing of money, and eventually he is going to get his way. But Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, he was bouncing around foreign countries. He's coming back to the United States. And oh my goodness, Alexander Hamilton's kind of creating all the stuff that America revolted against in the first place with Britain. National banks, federal taxes, taxes on popular beverages. Like, what is going on? Because Thomas Jefferson is a big states' rights guy. He writes the Declaration of Independence, and it's like, what are you doing here, Alexander Hamilton, with all of your big federal financial plans? So very quickly, the National Bank, as well as things like Assumption and the tariff and whatnot, opposition came from the more rural, agrarian, individualistic southern states, and the more financially developed, foreign trade involved, I don't want to say industrial quite yet, but more city-based northern states and more federalist stronghold states, that support's going to come from the north. But like I said, this first bank of the U.S. is going to be created. It was a very controversial decision because the Constitution does not specifically call for having a national bank, but one was created anyways. The first charter for it lasts 20 years, and its location was in Philadelphia. This would be a great time, by the way, if you're getting a little tired of my voice, is to go watch the Jefferson versus Hamilton tea dinner clip from the old HBO show, because they're arguing, you hear them arguing over basically the last couple of slides. One other thing to point out, this is a little separate from Hamilton, but a key lesson nonetheless, is partially because of that whiskey tax, a bunch of whiskey distillers or producers in western Pennsylvania basically tried leading a revolt. It's small potatoes. It's not anything that's like threatening to overthrow the United States, but it was ended. The important lesson, why does it show up in a history class here, guys, is that it ends when Washington sends in 13,000 federal troops, as probably romanticized and depicted in this painting here. And it was a strong message as they squashed this whiskey rebellion that the government, the U.S. federal government, has the ability and would enforce the law. You have to pay this whiskey tax. You're complaining about it. Well, we're going to send in federal troops until you fall in line. And this is a far cry. It's almost opposite, if you remember Shays' Rebellion under the Articles of Confederation, where private militia in Massachusetts have to come deal with disgruntled revolution veterans causing chaos in that state. No, now we have a federal government that can actually assert its authority. And at this point, if you're thinking with taxes and asserting federal authority, the pendulum has very much swung from a lot of individual rights and freedoms promoted in the Revolution era to a more controlled form of government in the era, this new era, under the Constitution. Whiskey Rebellion chunk, do not watch this whole video. I hate John Green for double-digit minutes, but there is a little snippet linked at the top of your lesson on the Whiskey Rebellion. I hinted at it earlier, but Jefferson and Hamilton, by the mid-1790s, if not sooner, had developed not into people that disagree with each other, but into a bitter, factionalized, that's even a word, a bitter political rivalry. And they disagreed on many things, you can even see here on the left and right on that picture. But the big core issue that they really fought about the most was that national bank argument. And it all came down to what the Constitution allows and doesn't allow, which is the implied powers debate. Bear with me, I always do this in person. I'm trying to think of a really basic girl's name. Emma. No offense, sorry if I have any Emmas in class this year. Let's say Emma brings in full meals to class. Well, let's say period 9, full meals to class. Like, I'm talking salmon, steak, appetizers, loaves of bread, like mashed potatoes, whole 9 yards, brownies, cheesecake, whatever. And is like getting them out of backpack, asking to go warm them up in a microwave, and is eating during lessons. As you might expect, like, I might go to Emma and say, what are you doing? Like, a snack and a drink is fine, but like full meals, it's a lunch period anyways, like we shouldn't have that in the classroom. Emma, if she's Alexandra Hamilton-esque, she might look at me and say, well, there's nothing in your syllabus, Mr. Hart, that says I can't have steak and mashed potatoes in your classroom, so I'm allowed to do it. You can't get me in trouble. Okay, that Emma, that's Alexander Hamilton, how he read the Constitution. Now, it's a really basic guy's name. Blake. Let's say I have a Blake in class who, let's say there's a day I get donuts for period 5. I don't know. I get I'm in a good mood. Okay. I get donuts, and everybody's going and getting donuts at the start of class, and Blake's sitting with his arms folded, not moving, kind of like actively donut denying, if you will, okay? And I go to Blake, who's just Mr. Sour Grapes or whatever, and I say, hey, get a donut. Like, it's not a big deal. You don't have to pay me money. It's low-key here. And Blake looks at me and says, hey, I read your syllabus, Mr. Hart. There's nothing in there that gives me permission to eat a donut. And I might look at him and say, well, the syllabus doesn't cover, like, literally everything. Like, you can go get a donut. Blake is Thomas Jefferson, okay, with how he read the Constitution. He said there's nothing implied about it. You can't read between the lines. If it doesn't specifically say I have permission, then I'm not allowed to have a national bank or eat that donut, okay? Again, sorry for the little sidebar here, but it's very confusing, and I think that food analogy actually helps you understand implied power. So I'm rambling here. But by the 1790s, political parties emerged because of this debate, because of these two people. And really, the Washington era, the start of it, no political parties. By the end of it, you had them. And it turns into the Democrat-Republicans, not to be, don't confuse it with Democrats-Republicans today, it's its own thing. Democrat-Republicans led by Thomas Jefferson, and then the Hamiltonian Federalists, who, yes, that was just an an ideology previously, but then the term Federalist turned into an actual formal political party. Now, back to George Washington. There's a revolution of their own in France. They helped us out. Thank you very much in the revolution that starts in 1789, began peacefully, but it soon got out of control. And if you know anything about European or world history, that is like the understatement of a lifetime. Early on, everybody was like, yeah, Viva Revolution, like that's awesome, we did our thing, now you go do your own thing, France. Everybody was on board, but as the revolution got more violent and they're starting to execute like wealthy and elites and toppling governments, Federalists, who were more elitist and pro-government in nature, started to be like, I don't know about this French Revolution thing, but the Democrat Republicans and Jeffersonians, big-time supporters of the French Revolution. They actually wanted us to go help the French in the Revolution. But George Washington, being a keen decision maker, actually proclaims neutrality in 1793 to basically America. We wouldn't get involved in the messy and actually getting a little like more than just France being involved. Britain starts getting involved. Proclaims neutrality in 1793 and basically says, hey, France, I'm sorry, you helped us in ours, but it is not in our own interests and benefit to join in your revolution right now, since we are such a young developing country. You helped us as an established empire, and we're not there yet. Sorry, you are on your own. One of the biggest decisions of Washington's presidency. Now, it is also important to remember that Britain didn't just disappear from North America after the Revolution. They still control British Canada. And the Great Lakes region, Michigan, northern Pennsylvania, Indiana, Ohio, stuff like that, they weren't completely gone from that area, even though it was ceded to the U.S. And they actually allied with some native groups like Miami Confederacy. There was an important battle, 1794. I think this is actually the Fort Wayne, Indiana, is named after. Mad Anthony Wayne routs the Miami at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. You can see its location here. I think that's very far southeast Michigan, right next to Lake Erie. And they say as the smoke cleared on the battlefield, it was noted that the Miami had been supplied weapons and things like that from the British. So there was a lot of anti-British sentiment. The other thing that was going on still, because Britain is post-revolution continued to be the most dominant force on the seas across the world. Impressment, which is basically the forced kidnapping and servitude for people in the British Navy through intimidation, threats, attacking ships and forcing prisoners to serve in the British Navy. That continued, and that annoyed the daylights out of American sailors who feel like they are their own independent American citizens now, but the big bully that is the British Navy continued with the impressment practice. So there was a lot of frustration. There's tension rising because the Federalists are more pro-British and want to ally with them economically, but there are kind of some grassroots frustrations with the American population with the British. Again, the revolution didn't just completely eliminate their influence from the states. There's a picture here of, I think, a U.S. citizen being hauled away by the British. I think I heard in a conference once that impressment was one of the most, if not the most, before and after the revolution, protested subjects in terms of like voicing discomfort in the streets about impressment in the form of protesting by American citizens across the states due to their annoyance. Now, Washington's arguably greatest decision he ever made was in some ways not a decision, or the decision to stop being president. So, partially due to his age, he steps down in 1796 after a second term. He had full, I'll put it this way, he totally could have stayed till the day he died as president. There was no rule about 2 terms the way we have it today, where 8 years, okay, that's all you can give. But Washington set a precedent that would be respected all the way until World War II with Franklin Roosevelt. set a precedent that no man should serve more than 2 terms in office. He felt the office should outlive the occupant. And he's going to give a very famous farewell address. I'm going to have you read a portion of it here in a second. Should also be noted, because Washington and slavery will come up, his will, he didn't free any slaves while alive. His will did include instructions about freeing of slaves in kind of a multi-step process. I will say I think some of that will, there were some hiccups with it actually being implemented, but that did happen. Slavery was not addressed in his farewell address, though I will mention that as well. The greatest gift he gave to America was probably in his leadership, his willingness to not take over and try to be a king. He saw leadership as using multiple voices, not just his own. And again, his willingness to step away from power is probably one of the best things that ever happened in American history. So that's Washington in a nutshell. You now, hopefully I can get my face out of the way enough here. You pause the video. I want you to read this primary source. It's a portion of his farewell address, which again was partially written and influenced by Hamilton himself. But I want you to pause it, and then you have 2 pop-up questions or answers or whatever. I want you to see these 2 about foreign relations and political parties, and I want you to reflect and tell me, obviously foreign relations and political parties are a big deal today, tell me how Washington felt about those 2 topics moving forward. So pause, read, answer, and then resume this whenever you're ready to go. Okay, I'll take it you've answered those questions now, and we're going to move on to John Adams, okay? The 1796 election, now that Washington stepped down, is going to pit John Adams, the Federalist, versus Washington's vice president, by the way, versus Thomas Jefferson, the leader of the emerging Democrat-Republican Party. Hamilton had too many enemies. He was a little too stuffy, honestly, in some ways. And Adams was a little bit more of a safer, middle of the road kind of candidate compared to Hamilton, who a lot of people felt was an extremist. Adams squeaks by in a razor-thin election, 71 to 68. And at that time, interestingly enough, presidents and vice presidents didn't like pair up with each other and like get aligned and like run together. Second place actually became vice president. And because of the Electoral College, how it was run at the time, Thomas Jefferson, who's about to be, if he wasn't already, a mortal enemy of Adams, is actually going to become vice president. That would be, guys, if whoever loses in November, at this point Biden's still in the race, if Biden or Trump, the loser would become that president's vice president. Think about how crazy that. Think about Donald Trump as vice president to Joe Biden, how insane that would be. This is what happened back then before they kind of nailed down the whole vice president as part of the winner's party. Adams, not as glamorous, but probably one of the more important founding fathers. He was a rock star at the Second Continental Congress during the Revolution. Very highly intelligent man. But he wasn't a man of the people type. Respectful irritation is used with them. I read once that his style was to confront, shout, rant, and then finally embrace and come back down to earth and reason with people. Abigail Adams, there's a video on her linked in your lesson. One of the most influential early females in American history because of the fact that she had Adam's ear, not just for social and family dynamics, but also for political ones as well. This is direct from a book called Founding Fathers. With her at his side, he had no real need for a cabinet, which he actually historically ignored. So Abigail Adams, very influential. Their letter exchanges with each other are very famous. And that's a map you can notice. Electoral College already is starting to get sectionalized with Jefferson taking much of the South, but Adams, his stronghold being in the North and in New England. So France, they're not so happy about Washington's decision to leave them out in the cold with their revolution, for us to stay neutral. There was also a treaty made known as Jay's Treaty that was seen or perceived as very pro-British. It was an agreement we made with England, and it was seen as kind of like bending the knee a little bit to Britain, even after we had beaten them in war, and France didn't like that either. So this is going to lead to some issues with France under Adams' administration. First thing you mentioned is something called the XYZ affair, which were like labels or code names given to 3 diplomats, American diplomats, that Adams sent over to France to try to negotiate with the French government in good faith about the brewing tension between America and France's government. But these diplomats were very disrespected. They never even made it to negotiations. And upon arriving, they were asked, demanded money, attempted to be bribed, things like that. And they come home, Americans are fired up, they feel disrespected by the French, how they treat our diplomats. This has gone down as the XYZ affair. What's going to happen is something called a quasi-war is going to break out with France, which basically means fighting is going to start happening between the French and Americans, but it's never going to become an official war, even though fighting and killing on a small scale is going on, but nothing official is ever declared. So it's called a quasi-war, because it never was really an official war. But it's an issue and it's a challenge for Adams nonetheless. So, despite his Federalists, which that's Adams' party, Federalists are more pro-British, and the Jefferson Democrat Republicans generally more pro-French. So, it would make sense that Adams' own party, the Federalists, were actually on board with all-out war against France. They didn't like the French. They were more like, let's be allies with the British. But Adams, in one of the most fall on your sword, impressive decisions in early American politics, Adams decides that all-out war with France would not be good for the overall health of America. And he says, hey, I know that's going to cost me popularity with my own party, but I think I need to look out for the overall good of America first. And it just, whenever I come to this, think about politicians today. If we even had 10% of them that took the Adams stance of, I'm not going to vote with my party, I'm going to vote for what's best for America, how much different that would make our country, but I digress. Now, what ends up happening is they come to the negotiation table. Napoleon Bonaparte is taking power at this point, and the Convention of 1800, instead of through brutal warfare, is going to officially end the alliance we created with France during our revolution, and is going to basically settle this issue, at least for a little bit, with the conflicts we were having with specifically the French Navy on the seas and whatnot with the quasi-war. So, finally getting to our last topic, and again, I know it's a little bit of a longer lesson. But under Adams' presidency, Congress was mostly controlled by Federalists. And they are going to pass a pair of acts that are kind of known in connection with each other, known as the Alien and Sedition Acts, that were a big step in federal authority and were grossly unpopular. The first one, the Alien Act, basically raised requirements from needing to live in America from 5 to 14 years to become a U.S. citizen. And then the second would basically be that the president would have the authority to deport or jail any foreigners, so people within those 14 years, I guess, in times of peace or hostilities. The general idea here, really behind the scenes, was that fresh immigrants, people to the United States, were more likely to be Jeffersonian in nature because they wanted the freedom and liberty that kind of the Democrat-Republican Party promoted. So this was a not-so-sneaky way for them to extend the years that those people could become voters. And then the idea of a president being able to deport or jail people in times of peace was of great concern to your Bill of Rights advocates and things like that. Speaking of Bill of Rights, the Sedition Act, Part 2 of this, was legislation that said anyone who impeded or criticized even the policies of the government in print or falsely accused or defamed elected officials could be liable and could be prosecuted by the federal government, which a lot of people scream, probably rightly so, bloody murder, that this was an infringement of the newly created First Amendment. What, freedom of speech, freedom of press, what do you mean I can't criticize a government official in a newspaper? And there were all kinds of examples of people actually being jailed, and prosecuted for violating the Alien and Sedition Acts, and they're wildly unpopular at the time. So much so that big names, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, pen statements that otherwise become known as the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And they basically made the argument that states, under a theory called the compact theory, had the right to refuse and basically ignore laws that they felt were unfair. Because states originally were the ones that ratified and bought into the idea of a constitution. So if said federal government passes something that they disagree with, states would have the right to basically ignore it. It would be the equivalent of students saying, if a teacher promotes a policy that they deem wholly unfair and against Center Grove High School school board policies, that individual students would actually have the right to skip or not do those assignments without punishment, because students are buying in and creating work for the teacher in the first place. That was the compact theory with rejecting. It was all about frustrations with the Alien and Sedition Acts. A lot of topics this chapter. But with an election and a new century around the way, you have two set-in political parties. And their separation comes from all of the topics, from excise taxes to military enforcement to Bill of Rights versus Alien and Sedition Acts. And I include this in your notes, but as a good breakdown for a key study guide question about the different belief systems and the appeals that each of these political parties had with the American public. So, with that said, if I can get out of the slideshow here, you're done with your notes. You should be down here. Videos, if you want to watch one or two more now that you're finished with the lesson, that is all good and well. The only other thing for today, as you look into an Albert Day on Thursday or Friday with your teams, you need to go get a Sedition Acts case study. Looks like this, just in paper. Real simple. You just have 3 case studies with some short questions, very quick, easy readings. I think you can have this done like 15 or 20 minutes. To be honest, in the second half of your class, ideally, that you're in now. And then your only homework or work that you could honestly get done in class would be to touch up and finish, with help of your notes, obviously, your Chapter 9 study guide. Again, at a limited amount, I will have push notifications on as I travel. Email me if there's issues or whatever. But hopefully today went smoothly, and now you'll transition into setting up for multiple classes, preparing and studying for your first team test. Thank you, and look forward to seeing you next week.